Better? All right. Some of this I think I covered in the first portion, but I went back and added a few things just to kind of bring up some information. Now, we looked at a little bit about the flood. We saw the volcanoes that were erupting, the earthquakes. You know, imagine the force that it would take to rip entire continents apart. You know, as I said before, all indications are it was one great big continent covering much of the world, or even most of the world. I think today the world is 72%, something like that, water. Estimates are that it could have been as much as 80 to 90% land. So, you know, this great big, humongous planet, or not planet, continent, and then imagine the sheer strength it would have taken to have ripped them apart. And if you ever look at a map, the parts do look almost like they fit. And so they more than likely did fit, and they were split apart during the time of the flood. Imagine the damage that that kind of a flood would do. When was it? It's been a couple of times that there have been major floods. And, you know, I've gone a time or two and just surveyed the damage. And I mean, literally a small flood can just wipe a house completely off. It can demolish a house. Back several years ago, that wasn't Japan, but it was over in that area. You know, this tsunami came in, and it was like 30, 40-foot waves, and it just wiped out everything that it hit. That was on a very small scale. Picture something worldwide. Now, during the flood, and I put true science versus false science, this is a fact that all over the world you'll find continuous layers of rock, in some cases miles and miles thick, and running across thousands and thousands of miles in length. Now, my wife said, what are you going to do with these cardstock? Imagine, and I'm not very imaginative, but imagine that a wave of water comes through and it's got dirt and silt, and it settles down, hardens almost instantly. Then a little later, here comes another, you know, great wave through, and it's got mud and dirt, and it lays it down, and it hardens because of the pressure. Then here comes another great wave, and it comes flying along and settles down. And of course, because of the pressure of the water, it would harden almost immediately. And what is that? 3. I've got 6 each, but imagine each of these coming along and laying down mud and dirt, and it being hardened almost immediately. What would you expect to find when you go and look at this pile? What would you expect to find? All right, let me straighten them up a little bit, see if that helps. What would you expect to find now? What would you expect to find? Multiple layers, exactly. Has anybody ever been to the Grand Canyon? That's the only thing on my bucket list. Well, that's the next. I got 2 things on my bucket list. One of them is to see the Grand Canyon, walk down it as much as I can. Actually, yeah, my wife says with my legs ain't gonna happen, but I've seen thousands of pictures of it, and it looks very much like this, with some of them buckled. You know, some of them kind of buckled under there. Others got, you know, different layers as they laid down. But if you go to the Grand Canyon, this is exactly what you would find, which indicates that each of these 6 layers Of course, the Grand Canyon's thousands of layers. Each of these layers, you can see them, perfect layers of dirt, silt, and then on top of that is another very clear layer of dirt and mud that was hardened. And so, you know, the whole entire Grand Canyon was probably formed from thousands of layers of, you know, water's burying stuff, more water coming along, burying stuff. And if you ever get a chance to go or look at some real close-up pictures, I mentioned Dr. Snelling. He's got multitudes of really good pictures of the Grand Canyon. You would say, that's blue. That was laid down separately. That one's white. It was laid down separately. It's not blue, it's not purple. So, you know, this layer was laid down. Then more dirt came along, different combinations of dirt and minerals. And you can see that each of them are perfect layers, and each of them are different, made up of different compositions. And so as you do that, some of them are literally as thin as this paper. Some of them are inches thick, but they're all in perfect layers as this water would bury them, harden them, next layer, burden them. Now, I mentioned that. How was the Grand Canyon carved out? First time I heard anything about this, a lady was talking and she was telling her son, see the Colorado River way down yonder? Yes, ma'am. The Colorado River used to be at the top of the Grand Canyon, and over millions and millions of years, the Colorado River gradually wore that down to where it's what, couple miles deep in some places, but the Colorado River wore it down over millions of years. What is a much better explanation? Now, I mentioned that the clay was compressed because of the pressure, but it was still soft. It wasn't completely dried out yet. It was still somewhat pliable. And you got this mighty torrent of water rushing out to the ocean. Do you think that water may have carved out the Grand Canyon? If you start at the very top, it's like here with layers, and then as you go down, it gets more narrow and more narrow because the water would have rushed out, and then as the water decreased, it would have gradually, gotten smaller and smaller, and the canyon is carved in as the water got more, smaller. Now, all that's left of it is the Colorado River. But can you imagine a worldwide catastrophe big enough to make the Grand Canyon with all those layers, miles, ever how big it is, miles thick? In the Grand Canyon, this isn't in your notes, but I have seen pictures, great big rocks. I mean, we're talking rocks 5, 10 feet deep that were rocks. You can see the layers in the rocks, and the rock was just bent in two and then hardened. False science can't explain how you bend a 5-foot rock without breaking it. What happens if you bend a rock? What happens if you bend a rock 90 degrees? It's going to shatter. And yet at the Grand Canyon, they've got rock after rock after rock that are bent, some of them in 90-degree angles, and yet the lines, the lines are the same lines. They don't stop. You got the line going up and that same line going down, next line going over, going down, which means that rock was continuous at one time, and it was bent while it was still soft and pliable, which would have been immediately after the flood. All right, let's move on. Some of these layers that they have found, even in the Grand Canyon, You can see little ripples of water, that the water was rippling along and got compressed, and you can still see the ripples of water in the layers of rock. What would have happened if those ripples of water took millions of years to harden? What would have happened to those little ripples of water? Yeah, they would have flattened out. What would have happened, and like I say, some of those layers aren't much thicker than this, those layers of rock. What would have happened if a layer of rock this thick was laid down, and then it was a million years before another layer came along on top of it? What would have happened to this layer? It would have gone. The wind, the rain would have worn it away. There's no way possible you could have all of these layers, and each layer taking millions of years to form. But you get an idea. Picture the Grand Canyon, and that's only one very teeny tiny bit of the damage that was done during the flood. I mentioned some of these layers start in I think the biggest one, if I'm correct, starts in Australia, and it goes, you can trace it, layer, 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 layer across America, same layers going all the way across, even on up into Canada, and yet it took, you have to admit, they were all laid down at the same time, because it's the same layer going across, so that 1,000-mile layer had to be laid down at the same time, or it wouldn't have been one continuous layer. I just throw that in. Imagine the amount of dirt and mud and everything else that would have been churning and churning and churning while the world was literally being turned upside down. Now, I put some interesting facts, at least for me. How many of you remember the slogan, "Put a tiger in your tank"? What gas was that? Wasn't Exxon. What gas was it? Put a tiger in your tank? I don't remember. But do you know what oil is made of? You know what oil is made of? Animals that were compressed together and literally squeezed the daylights out of them. And can you imagine how many animals it took to make the billions and billions of oil that we find in Iran? We have more oil in America than Iran if we were just allowed to use it. But how many animals would it have taken to form the billions and billions and billions of oil that we find around the earth? How many of you know what coal is made from? How many of you know what coal is? I know you do, yeah. Coal is formed by vegetation being compressed down. And again, I've not seen this, but I've seen pictures of it. They were blasting for coal. I don't remember where it was, but they were blasting for coal, and they blasted out a section of coal, and in the top of that coal was a perfectly formed snake that had been crawling along and got buried under the coal and fossilized. Actually, no, he wasn't fossilized. He was still very much a snake and got buried between the layers of coal. He got caught up in some trees, vegetation. How much vegetation, and I'm trying to give you an idea of the world before the flood, how much vegetation would it take to form the billions of tons of coal that we've got in the world today? So you get an idea of how many animals were on the earth. before the flood? How much vegetation was on the earth before the flood? Did I say something wrong? What's Angelo got to say? S.O. Yeah, he's older than I am, so he remembers it. Ask him if he's passed his kidney stones yet. Yeah, S.O. Yeah. But literally, the oil in the earth was formed by billions of animals being squashed under the weight of the water and the pressure, and squeeze the oil out of them, and we dig up how many, America uses 300,000 barrels of oil a day or something like that. Imagine how many animals were on the earth before the flood. They have found palm leaves that are over 6 feet wide. Gives you an idea of what it was before the flood. But now the earth has all been churned, and, picture a washing machine, churning, backing, and the whole world is being turned, and this wave comes in, water comes in, volcanoes erupt, spewing water all over. Imagine the amount of pressure that was. Now, imagine I've already touched that, the continents being literally ripped apart. And what kind of tsunamis would they cause? So when Noah and them came out of the ark, the earth looked absolutely nothing like we see today. I remember, let me think of his name. Oh, Bill Gaither. Bill Gaither took an Alaskan cruise several years ago, and they filmed it, and I've watched that video a couple of times, and there's some place in Alaska where it's got this beautiful creek flowing down the side of the mountain with the little rocks making ripples, and it's a beautiful picture. And I remember, because I almost screamed at the TV, he said, just look at this beauty that God created just like this. And it's like, no, this is not the creation. This is the result of the flood. But still it's beautiful. Even after the flood, look at all the beauty that's left after God got through judging the world. But it would look nothing like what it did when Noah and them came out. The floodwaters, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Not just this light sprinkle that we get sometime. I've got an intermittent thing on my windshield wipers. If it's a heavy rain, you turn it all the way up. And if it's really heavy, you take it off intermittent and put it on full, back and forth. But if it's just a real light drizzle, you can turn it down and it'll and then wait for 30, 40 seconds. No, this was the raining cats and dogs. I mean, torrential downpours raining upon the earth with the volcanoes and the earthquakes. And I mean, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Then it took 150 days after that for the waters to stop rising, level out, and begin to recede. That's how long it took. The earth is churning and, back and forth. And finally, as the volcanoes stopped, the earthquakes stopped, the water finally began to level out 22 feet above the highest mountain. Why 22 feet? You what? I didn't hear you. The ark was 300 cubits, 75 cubits tall, 40 cubits wide. 75, and I'm basing this on Dr. Morris, 75 feet with all that weight would have been below the water about 15 to 20 feet. So God made sure that it was high enough that the ark would sail over the highest mountain and still have a little bit left to clear. But imagine this. Now, I asked this last week, I think. Where did all the water go? The oceans hold a large portion of the water. There are lots and lots and lots of water out in the ocean. During this time, as the waters are, coming down from the mountains, rushing out to the oceans, they would carve out, the Grand Canyon and other things. When the water would get trapped, something would cut off the flow. We call those lakes today. That's where the waters were going down. And then something happened, the earth caved in, something happened, and the water remained puddled, and we call those lakes today. Imagine what Noah must have felt like when he stepped off the ark and the earth is bare, no trees, no vegetation, not much anyway. He did find the dove, found a olive leaf. Found an olive leaf means there was some vegetation. But can you imagine when he stepped off and looked at the earth for the first time after the flood? Can you imagine adjusting to a new atmosphere? And we'll get into that maybe. Who was it I was talking to? Had to take my brother to the dentist yesterday, and had to be somebody in the waiting room. But, I said, where are you from? Well, I'm from Florida. I came up here, and instead of being warm, it turned super cold. And I said, you'll get climatized. She said, I've been here 10 years, and I haven't yet. Can you imagine, before the flood, it was the same perfect temperature everywhere. Go anywhere on the earth, and it's the same temperature. Now, you come out, you got these winds blowing, you've got the canopies gone, so there's no constant temperature anymore. Imagine when he stepped out, how he must have felt and what he must have thought when he hits that first cold blast of air for the very first time. Now, and I put Genesis 8:22 in there. I've read that many times, but never put it quite in this context until today. God told Noah after the flood, he put the rainbow up there as a sign of the covenant. There will never be another local flood on earth. Has there ever been a local flood? Y'all have local floods all the time, yeah. God said there will never be another worldwide flood. So every time you see a rainbow, that's God's promise. But here's what he told Noah after he came out. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter. And I can almost hear Noah. What is cold? What is heat? It's always been a perfect temperature. Now, it's kind of like before the flood. What is rain? God said there's going to be cold and heat, summer and winter. They had never had cold and heat. They had never had summer and winter. I was talking to another lady this week, and she's from down in the Dallas area. And she said, oh, it is just hot all the time. I said, yeah, I used to be in Houston. If it got down to 60 degrees, they were having a cold front at 60. He's never had cold and heat. You know, wait a minute, what are you talking about, Lord? Well, go make some extra coats because you're fixing to need them here pretty soon. Now, we look at the earth today. We see huge mountain ranges. Indications are before the flood there were little hills, you know, maybe little hills because, you know, he talks about the hills. When we first moved to Texas, one of the families there invited us over to dinner one night. Now, we're used to Ohio, northern Kentucky, you know, up around Dayton. You know, he said, okay, give me directions to your house. He said, you know, you go this road, turn on this road, and we're the house right across from the big hill. So we go and we turn, and we drive for miles and miles. And finally we called him and said, where is your house? It's right across from the big hill. It was a hill no bigger than that door back there. I mean, obviously I had to learn a whole new definition. But today there are mountain ranges. You know, the Smoky Mountains, we've been up on it. Other mountains. There are deep valley gorges, think Grand Canyon, drastic climate changes. The North Pole, and I read an article, oh, it's been a couple months ago, how cold it is up on the North Pole and how cold it is down on the South Pole. And they were telling about people that actually live there and how they have to live and how they have to keep warm. They would not have had that problem. Now, question that gets asked, and I hope you already know the answer. Evolution says, and this evolution does say this, that there was an ice age back in prehistoric times. Just like dinosaurs, Christians used to say there are no such thing as dinosaurs, and then there was no such thing as an ice age. Well, if you go out west, and I've never been out west, but I'm told that, well, even in Texas, we had some friends of ours fly down, and they were from up around Dayton, and I was taking them back to the airport. They spent a week with us. We were going back to the airport, and he asked me how long it would take to get to Houston. I said, about an hour. So we pull out, and we're just a few miles from home, and he said, right there's Houston. What do you mean it's going to take us a couple of hours to get there? And I said, John, that's at least 20 miles away. No, I can see it. I said, John, I'm telling you, it's at least 20 miles away. So we clocked it. It was just a little over 20 miles, and it was as flat could be. I'm told in some of the western states, they are just as flat can be. And again, I'm getting this from Dr. Morris. I'm getting this from, other men that have been there, studied it. That after the flood, there's no more canopy. So there's not consistent temperatures. The atmosphere is still trying to settle, trying to, figure out the atmospheric conditions. And so, the volcanoes were spewing ash up into the atmosphere. What happens when rain is seeded with ash or anything else? What happens to rain or moisture in the air? It changes. When it's seeded, it changes to rain. So you got all these volcanoes pushing tons of ash up into the atmosphere, seeding the water that's up there, the water comes down, and because of the different climate and the different atmosphere, it hasn't got the North Pole, South Pole, the equator. Everything is still, in a turmoil. So the water comes down. It's in a cold area, so it freezes in the form of snow. And then it begins to melt. Then there's another cold front as the atmosphere is still adjusting. More ice or snow piles up. It begins to melt. More snow piles up. Estimates are that the ice age, real, genuine, true ice age, could have lasted 100 years or more, as it would fall, melt away, and as it melted, it would, kind of level out a little bit. Then it would snow, then it would level out, and that's why we find areas that are, so level. It's because of the volcanoes spewing ash up, and then the moisture in the air as it's coming back down, and the world is trying to find a normal for that part of the world. I don't want to. We'll stop there on top of